podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week is the second part of a two-part interview with Robin Veldman, assistant professor of religious studies at Texas A&M University. And so we're continuing our discussion of the relationship between evangelicals and climate change, particularly in relationship to Robin's work that came out a couple of years ago called The Gospel of Climate Skepticism, Why Evangelical Christians Oppose Action on Climate Change. So a lot of thought-provoking discussion here, the intersection of religion, economics, politics, and how all of those things shape responses to climate change in different communities across different races, ages, genders. So really interesting discussion. I hope you enjoy it as well. Who even counts as an evangelical? Because then you start to see, well, if you're not exposed to these ideas in these communities or these, mass media, then you might call yourself evangelical, but you're going to be so different than some other evangelical elsewhere on the planet.
Yeah.
Like I know, Catherine Hayhoe is a good example because she's Canadian. And I
Yeah.
wonder, is American evangelicalism like a unique problem?
Yes, I think so. I really think so. And that's how she talks about it that way too. She was, like I grew up in Canada, so I had no idea of all these like particular battles that Americans fight.
Hmm.
And what's so interesting about evangelicalism in America is it's so closely tied to um, ideas about what America means, and the notion that America was founded as a Christian nation. This kind
Right.
of myth that a lot of Americans used to believe, but really evangelicals are the ones who have like latched onto it hardcore. And so I don't think that you see that if you go to Canada. I don't think there's like a Canadian, nationalism tied to like evangelical faith. I think that's unique to
Right.
our history.
Right.
And I've looked. I had a colleague who does research in Brazil, and we didn't look
Hmm.
at climate attitudes like in general, but Brazilian evangelicals were not skeptical or anti-environmental the way American evangelicals are. So
Hmm.
again, like that led me back to, okay, I don't think it's like the faith tradition. I think it's what's happening in American culture, the religious right, politics, and then there's also some like unique things about the way evangelicalism is connected to oil country in the United States that
Hmm.
um, these kind of hard to see connections that may have an influence in a way that's rather invisible, but like over decades accumulates.
No, that's a good point. I would think definitely, for me, growing up in Texas, the reality of oil is pretty serious. And
Yeah.
so I can imagine that would get entangled with your faith and your politics and all that. It's like, well, this is our economic base. And so if climate activists are coming after oil, then they're coming after us as people, and we don't even trust that. They must be some kind of economic takeover. They're just trying to take our money away. So yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it because it's really evangelicals in the South in the United States predominantly,
Um,
or
yeah, I think I want to say that Southerners. I would have to go back and look and see if like Southerners have more. Like if you include evangelicals and then include Southern, which one shakes out in terms of uh, like some kind of quantitative analysis. I'm not sure, but evangelicalism has been really driven by the like Southern, Protestants. And then there's these really fascinating connections, which Darren Dochek has teased out in his book, this enormous, massive book, Anointed with Oil, but I had noticed it, if you read the histories of evangelicalism, you start noticing, oh, the guy who put out the original pamphlets, the fundamentals that launched the fundamentalist movement, was an oil guy. And that's how he had his money. And
oh,
that's, how he was able to fund this enormous fundamentalist movement. And the connections are just over and over again. There's a lot of connections with the oil industry and evangelical Christianity. And yeah, it's complicated too, because apparently there are a lot of mainline Christians also on like other parts of the oil industry. So it's not just
right.
evangelicalism. But yeah, there's something, it's funny that I've ended up in Texas, and something that I hope to understand better. I mean, we've got like an oil rig statue on campus, and there's all this really amazing iconography of like I've seen, it's like an oil derrick sign with like a Christian fish inside, and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. So
Wow.
yeah, it's something I want to understand better. I do think it's really embedded in like religion and culture, but we haven't really like explored it.
It's true. Yeah, I only, relatively recently have heard people really referring to petroculture a
Yeah.
lot and really thinking of like, you have to understand culture as petroculture. Like, well,
Mm,
then what about petro faith and, petro
mm,
Christianity? And so, yeah, I think there's a long way to go for that. Yeah, you're definitely in the right place to be doing that research. That worked out pretty well. I'm
mm.
curious, more generally, how did you get into this research? What made you want to start piecing together religion and climate change, or evangelicals in particular? I'm always interested in hearing that because it's a unique field. Some people get into environmental issues and they focus on science, policy, economics, and then or some people study religion, but they're not always bringing those two worlds together.
Yeah. I know, it's fascinating. I really I wanna start a podcast that looks at everybody's, like, yeah, like, how they got into this stuff. I was, um, like, okay, long version or short version? There's I was really interested in environmental apocalypticism, basically. Like, I knew a bunch of environmental apocalyptics kind of in between college and grad school.
Mhm.
And so it was sort of this backdoor entry to studying evangelicals. Like most people who are like, yeah, I'm going to go get a degree in political science and study, focus on religion and politics. And that wasn't on my radar at all. I did this master's thesis. I looked at Al Gore and like, some other people trying to understand like if there were in an overly simplistic way that now makes no sense to me, but like, is it religious apocalypticism? Is it secular? Um, and then I just started hearing about the end time apathy hypothesis kind of thing that evangelicals were, end time believers, and so I just ran into it that way, and I was like, oh, evangelicals, okay, like that's another form of apocalypticism. That sounds interesting. And I really, at the University of Florida, I mean, if you're studying religion and nature, you don't basically study evangelicalism, right? Like
Right.
it's not like your first stop. Um, and so, yeah, so I got into this. That's why I ended up, was like starting my research, being like, wait, what's an evangelical? Like,
Yep.
so yeah, so I don't think I had the like. I've come to realize that most of the research on evangelicals happens in political science and sociology, as far as I can
Mhm.
tell. I know, there's religious studies scholars who do it, but so much of it happens on that side of things. And so yeah, I just came in through this odd little aperture in apocalypticism.
Yeah, that's a good one. I definitely grew up liking apocalypse just because I don't know, a little boy that likes violent stories, really.
Yeah,
And then you
it's
just
weirdly
see it
appealing.
everywhere, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I
That's,
think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, would you say Al Gore was an example of, being apocalyptic, like a secular apocalypse?
Um, I think what I ended I'm like, what did I actually argue? I went back and read my master's thesis recently. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, I didn't realize that's what I argued. It sort of like slipped in my mind. I think that I think I was really trying to push back against the idea that there's a hard and fast boundary between secular and religious
Mhm.
apocalypticism. Um, and of course, now that I've thought about it more, I'm like, well, yeah, the definition of religion is also contested. So of course,
Right.
how could you make that distinction? But there was a time period, I think, in the early 1980s, especially when there was like this big battle where people were like, there was this whole era of anti-environmental activism that put out these talking points saying, oh, environmental alarmists, they're just, doomsayers. And we're using all this anti-apocalyptic rhetoric in order to undermine environmentalists. And so I think I was trying to unpack those claims and just it's that discourse is used in order to make in order to make environmentalism look bad, drawing on that history of parallels with religious apocalypticism. It doesn't really have to do with the like reality of whether it, as a scholar we would look at it as religious or not. But yeah,
Right.
Al Gore is really interesting in that regard.
Right. Right. That's good. I'm sure it's like unfair to ask somebody about their master's thesis this far. And what was in your senior paper and your undergrad? I'm like, no, that's not. You can't ask me that. That's rude. Oh man, that's so interesting to me. Well, so overall, what you're seeing then is a very kind of patchwork kind of network of evangelicals where you have different degrees of concern for the environment or different degrees of skepticism about science. Where do you see the most uh, like positive work being done with evangelicals engaging in environmental issues or climate in particular? Aside from Catherine Hale, she's like the one evangelical big. Don't worry, we have Catherine. Like, well, there's got to be more though, right? So, where are you seeing like the most activism or action?
Yeah, I mean, I think Young Evangelicals for Climate Action is this organization that kind of branched out of the Evangelical Environmental Network, and they, I think, are really focusing on young evangelicals, which makes sense because they're, kind of their views are not necessarily as fixed as older evangelicals. So, I mean, and surveys suggest that they may be a little bit more like liberal on
Mhm.
environmental issues. I use that word liberal with like hesitation because some people don't like ever having that applied to them. But in this case, I mean, just more concerned about climate change. So yeah, I think, surveys seem to suggest that evangelicals right now overall are more kind of they're still more skeptical than the general public, but like their skepticism is not as extreme at this moment. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens because we're now at this kind of replay of where we were in 2008, 2009 with Waxman Markey, this like climate bill that was trying to work its way through Congress when Obama was president. And that ended up just kind of dying because it couldn't get enough support. And at that point, there was a lot of, people were like, Obama wanted to see this mass movement. And so there's a lot of like attempt to like get some grassroots energy. And evangelicals were part of this. There was this whole evangelical climate initiative, and it was like really seemed like they were going to kind of tip the scales in favor of action. But there's this massive backlash campaign and it never ended up happening. So now I feel like I am having weird flashbacks of that period because now we're like there again, it's like, Democratic president comes into office with a big ambitious agenda. And we're all expecting, I think everybody who's following climate change, like kind of following the different pieces that are falling into place. And so far, I haven't seen as much backlash as I saw previously.
Hmm.
And so it's possible that the people who were big opponents before now feel like, okay, this is a fait accompli, and we just like, it's not even worth our time to try to oppose it.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, this may be different. This may be a different time period. I think where I like am I'm gonna bring it back around to something, like, depressing, even though you asked a really positive question about, like, where's the energy? I think that there are still a lot of people who, because of the way climate change is often portrayed as this, like, big government attempt to take away American liberties, I think there are people, not just evangelicals, but in this broader, like, Christian nationalist sphere who have pretty strong feelings about it. So I'm gonna be interested to see what happens as it, kind of crystallizes whatever's going to happen in a legislative way. But it does seem like a lot of, like corporate America is kind of leaning in a favorable direction, and that makes a huge difference in terms of kind of whether anyone else decides to try to like block things.
Right.
So hopefully, we're at this will not be a repeat, and Biden will be able to like kind of get done what couldn't happen during Obama's years.
That wasn't too depressing. That was
I tried to like spin it in a positive way,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's good. I think that's important. At the end of the day, being like naively optimistic and hopeful doesn't really help us deal with the very real challenges that we have. So, a
It's
little bit
hard,
of
but when you talk to evangelical climate activists, they're so compelling. And so, every time I read an interview with one of them, I'm like, oh yeah, you're definitely gonna like swing this thing. Like they're so inspiring. So it's almost like one of those things where the closer you look, the less perspective you have because of just like the energy that emanates out of the activist community.
So yeah, if you're talking to the right evangelical, you're like, we're doing it. It's all going to work out. It'll be the all climate crisis solved within the
Yeah.
next 3 years. Yeah, that's a really special thing. 'Cause, when charisma is such a big part of the leadership in your tradition, then
Mm,
that helps in a way, but it can also be such a hindrance. Um, so yeah, interesting to note that overall it seems like the youth and then people of color seem to be showing a lot of like fracture really in the evangelical community where
mm,
there's really a diversity of perspective. And I guess with the youth too, that would also maybe bring it back to the question of digital communication and social media,
mhm.
and which again is that's a tough one to study. Really interested in that. Well, what, for folks like me who are scholars or for people who are activists, but we're not part of the evangelical community, like what are we supposed to do to kind of put our finger on the scales and try to encourage them to care more about climate science or care more about environmental issues in general, or should I just leave them alone? I know Catherine Hayhoe's thing is like, well, talk about it and
Yeah.
just keep the conversation going. I'm like, what do I say? I don't know how
Yeah.
to engage.
I think, yeah, I wish I had a really pithy and wonderful answer to that. But you took Catherine's little talking point, so I can't say that. Um, and I guess I think that my temptation is just to be open-minded, to say to be open-minded. I think one of the things I noticed in doing the research for the book is there's just all these unfortunate tensions between evangelicals and environmentalists. And so they often don't feel like that welcome in the environmental movement because the environmental movement has like both a secular wing and this like kind of alternative spirituality wing. At least that's how
Right.
I'm coming to like understand it.
Yeah.
Um, and so because of that, evangelicals have always been concerned about, new age, pantheism and all this stuff that is in reality part of some elements of the environmental movement.
Hmm.
Um, but on the other hand, I just think that a lot of people who are consider themselves secular just don't have much contact with evangelicals except through the media. And so then you get these kind of like one-sided portrayals. And so I think anything that breaks down barriers and starts conversations is really important in America. And I think just not even with the issue of climate change, but we've got a lot of divisions. Certainly, that's just one of them. So I think the more kind of really the more people can try to cross those social boundaries that have become so hardened and show that you know I think it's really important for somebody might get to know me and not know that I, have this like crazy research. Here I am in Texas and might, hopefully they'll think I'm a nice person. And then if I'm like, oh, and by the way, I research like faith and climate change, instead of having this like super negative reaction, I hope they'll be like, oh, well, she actually seemed pretty nice. So like maybe
Hmm.
she's got something interesting to say there instead of this like I've definitely had strong reactions like if I'm just meeting somebody and they ask, what I do, like it's not the best moment to fully explain. But yeah, no, I think building up community is so important because we've got some serious divisions. So that anything that does not alienate
Right.
is a challenge because there's some, real reconciliation that needs to happen in America related to race and all these things. So you can't overlook that either. Um, but but yeah, that would be my long-winded answer.
That's good. I appreciate that. Not too long. That was a reasonable amount of wind. Um, yeah, and I mean, the open mindedness is a really important part of it. Because if you're not open minded, the whole like, well, let's just keep talking. Like, well, you also need to make sure that you're not judging people too much based upon your assumptions. And it
Mhm.
really, yeah, it is the case. Because I'm, living in the San Francisco Bay Area now, and this is a hub of, like secular environmentalists and like earth-based spirituality.
Mhm.
And in a lot of cases, when I talk to those people, they often have negative attitudes toward Christianity as a whole, let alone evangelicalism. And this idea of, oh, God is this white guy in the sky. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
it's more nuanced than that. But you can tell they just like haven't met a lot of
Mhm.
Christians that definitely haven't met evangelicals. So
Yeah.
I'm like, well, it's going to be hard to have that conversation when you already know you're smarter than them, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
I would imagine evangelicals feel talked down to a lot.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating, and I wish at some point I like had it in mind to kind of. I've always wanted to research that more, but it's secular environmentalists are so dispersed. It's kind of hard to find them, especially well, where I'm personally located. It's more difficult too. But I remember reading. Have you ever read Starhawk's book, The Fifth Sacred Thing?
Yeah.
And like, I remembered at some point I was like, oh, like the bad guys are fundamentalists, and they're, like I do think that it's kind of like worked into the mythology a little bit of alternative spirituality. It does have a kind of chip on its shoulder about Christianity for sure. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Like people maybe grew up a Christian and then just stopped liking church and now they're like mad at it and
Yeah,
wounded Christians in a way, or people who never grew up in it at all, but then they read some of the literature, or like Lynn White, right, in 1967,
exactly.
being like, Christianity is basically the reason that we have this problem. Like, they're giving people a kind of overly simplified understanding of what's going on. And then decades later, that's now baked into secular environmentalism.
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, and I think secular environmentalists so often they don't understand the religious. They don't understand religion. They just ignore it. So they don't even. It's like not on their radar that that's even influencing how they interact with people.
Yeah.
So
Which
yeah.
goes back to your your master's thesis works, and maybe the secular religious thing isn't as a binary as it looks like. And a lot of, I mean, geez, the word secular is a religious word, right? So
Yeah.
it's like if you might think you're not religious, you're religious. There's religious ideas still percolating and influencing you. I know that's a big part of me whenever I'm teaching religion to students who really don't want to hear about it, maybe. So I'm like, well, guess what? It's everywhere. And you might
Mm,
not realize it, but it's even in secular movements. And so you
yeah.
need to investigate those things because they might be pushing and pulling you around more than you realize. And yeah, if secular environmentalism wants to work with evangelicals, they're going to need to start being a lot more open minded about religion in general.
Yeah, yeah, and like I think there's room for a bit more like awareness too of just I just my impression is that the environmental I mean Evan Barry has done such a good job of like showing the religious roots of the environmental movement, but I just don't think it's broadly known, And so it's so easy to just pretend that history doesn't exist and like pretend environmentalism is completely secular and all rational and based on science and that there's no like cultural religious movement dynamics that are really shaping its future.
Yeah, 'cause I feel like people are suspicious when a religious studies scholar says there's religious roots to things. They're like, well, that's just, you're just trying to get a job. Like, no, there's religious roots, but there's just such a lack of like religious literacy that
Mm,
even when there's good research on it, it doesn't get out there. People don't know how to digest it.
yeah. Well, it's
So yeah,
interesting. I think that really, like now that I'm at an institution that doesn't have a religious studies program, I definitely feel that um, it's all tied to the contested nature of religion in this country, and of course, like the fact that we don't teach it in primary schools or like not elementary, but like, high school or something like other countries do, but we don't. So then, you people get to college and they're like, oh, well, I don't want to study religion. Like, I don't want to go to seminary. And so you can't even get people in the door. Um, yeah. So it's like this systemic kind of blindness. But thankfully for us, we're here, we're trying to edify people and doing our best.
true, right? Yeah, just there's a few voices, and it's definitely a growing movement for sure. I mean, the religion nature folks, religion ecology, in the last 25 years has just really exploded.
Yeah.
But that's a tough one when people aren't getting it in primary education, then it's really an uphill battle when they come to higher ed, and we're like, I can't fix you at this point. And I like, at I'm at University of San Francisco. It's a Jesuit university, so religion is a core requirement.
Mm,
So they have to take it. But and then sometimes that means there's a lack of enthusiasm. They're like, I'm here because
mhm.
I have to be. And I try to like, no, it's you're gonna get a lot out of this because you can understand your world so much better. But at that point, yeah, like have to remind them of some basic things, like what even is Christianity?
Mhm.
And it's it's tough. There's a long way to go to get that religious literacy into the public. And I wonder at this point, it's awfully late in this discussion to bring up this point. what is an evangelical, right? Especially for anybody who's watching this who's not that familiar with the different sects of Christianity, and knowing that it's hard to define them because it's not a centralized movement, and depending on the age, the community you're looking at, the race, there's so many different evangelicals. Do you have like a definition? What is evangelicalism?
Yeah. There's a definition that the National Association of Evangelicals uses, which comes from the historian David Bebbington. And that's been the standard definition. It's a very theological definition. So, you can debate whether theology really is the best measure, or, I mean, there's just sort of different approaches to measuring evangelicals. Sometimes people say the way to tell is to ask someone, are you an evangelical? If they say yes, they're an evangelical. So like that's the self-identification measure. And then there's like the theology, which is, if I can remember, there's 4 pieces and I always forget one of them. There's activism, which is like going out and spreading the gospel or the good news. Crucicentrism, the focus on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ's redemptive nature on the cross. Biblicism, high regard for the authority of scripture, and there's always one that I forget. Activism, biblicism, crucicentrism, and I cannot think of it right now.
Those
There's
are
always
all.
like that fourth one that like escapes me.
Those are still pretty helpful. I know in my own experience that helps to make sense of the people I've met who identify as evangelical, for sure. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, such an interesting community, and just so important for our future.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of the wake up call that a lot of secular environmentalists need. It's like, look, these are people that are important for our politics, for the future of the nation. So we got to have a discussion.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I really appreciate this book, The Gospel of Climate Skepticism. That's just so incredibly helpful to the field. And then thanks for having, I guess, the courage to get into something like that. That's a tough topic. So I appreciate you diving in.
Thank
And
you.
and geez, I could just talk to you about this for a while. I'll have to have you back on sometime and kind of see what you're up to and what your new research is, what's going to be next for you. So I wonder before I let you go, what's the future looking like for you? What's like a project you're working on now, or what's the summer looking like? Even doesn't have to be your whole future plans.
Thanks. And thank you for your kind words about the book. I was scared to publish the book actually, because I felt like I was calling out some people who have a lot of power, and especially in the previous administration they did.
Right.
But I guess because it's an academic book, it just didn't attract enough attention to really, put me in anybody's crosshairs. Um, so anyway, I'm working on um, exploring the intersection of Christian nationalism and anti-environmentalism,
Mm,
which is, so it's quite similar in a sense, but I kind of wanted to broaden out to try to understand how religiously inflected anti-environmentalism is found, not just within evangelicalism, but like also among like white Catholics and other groups that have a certain view about America, and to also try to better understand that media piece, which has been kind of, or I feel like I just slightly cracked open the door, but there's so much more to explore.
nice.
So that's what I'm working on.
Not easy topics.
Oh, I'm onto the dark side for some
Yeah.
reason. I don't know,
Well,
like,
good. Somebody's got to do it. So thanks.
yeah, no,
And
next
yeah, oof.
next project's got to be something different, like something just like completely on the other side.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Like just study of, how puppies are cute, something like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
That would be perfect, like as restorative therapy and research.
Yeah, mostly just looking up cute puppy pictures and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, that's, one of the things I think for the study of religion and nature, it's like both the religious side and the nature side. It's a lot of heavy,
yeah,
difficult things to get through. So keep it up, and good. It's good news that we're academics, that we don't get in people's crosshairs, so we can do really important work and
yes,
not become targets. That's hopefully that can continue into the future.
yeah. I definitely don't want to be in the crosshairs of anybody. Yeah.
Well, good. That's a good note to end on. Don't put us in the crosshairs, folks.
Yeah, signing off.
All right. Well, Robin Veldman, thank you so much for being on here, and I'm looking forward to having you back sometime in the future. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be
Thank you
back
so much.
next week with another episode and more discussions for you. All right. Bye-bye.